Imagine an emperor at the height of his power, commanding an army so vast it seemed unstoppable. Europe had bowed before him, kings had fallen, nations trembled at the mention of his name. And yet, within just a few months, this same emperor would stand on a frozen battlefield, watching his empire bleed into the snow. This is the story of Napoleon's most fatal mistake, the invasion of Russia. The summer of 1812 began with a thunderous spectacle. Across the fields of Eastern Europe, the earth shook under the boots of over 600,000 men. Horses whinnied, cannons groaned on their carriages, and wagons stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a river of humanity flowing east, unstoppable, confident, and proud. At the head of this tide rode Napoleon Bonaparte, the conqueror of Europe, the man who had bent the world to his will. Dressed not in glittering finery, but in his plain gray coat and bicorn hat, he was instantly recognizable. To his men, he was not just an emperor, he was destiny itself. But among the soldiers, behind the cheers and drums, whispers traveled like a chill on the wind. Russia was not Spain. Russia was not Austria. It was endless, mysterious. A land of forests and steppes where the roads vanished into swamps, and winters could devour entire armies. Still, who could doubt Napoleon? Had he not won at Austerlitz, humbled the mighty Austria and Prussia, forced even the Tsar himself into uneasy peace? Surely Russia would bow the same way. That confidence was intoxicating. Young recruits wrote letters home, promising they would return before the first snow. Veterans hardened by years of war carried a quieter determination. For them, it was not victory they longed for, but survival pay and the hope of one more day alive. As the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River, the border into Russian lands, the silence was unnerving. No Russian army met them. No defenders stood guard. Only abandoned villages, scorched fields, and empty wells. The Russians were retreating, but not in fear. They were drawing Napoleon deeper, luring him into the vastness of their homeland. On the horizon, smoke curled into the sky. The Russians burned their own crops, destroyed their own homes, leaving nothing behind but ashes. Soldiers of the Grand Army marched through ghost towns, their stomachs already tightening with hunger. Still, Napoleon pressed forward. To him, the retreat of the Russians was a sign of weakness. To his soldiers, it was a sign of something far more dangerous. A war against not men, but against the land itself. What none of them knew was that the fire before the snow was only the beginning. The Grand Army pressed forward like a storm front rolling over the earth. 600,000 men. Endless columns of infantry, cavalry, wagons, and artillery stretched further than the eye could see. To the peasants who glimpsed this tide from their villages, it was as if the horizon itself had begun to move. But the deeper the army marched, the stranger the silence became. Fields lay blackened and barren. Granaries smoldered with deliberate ruin. Even the wells were poisoned or smashed to rubble. The Russians had vanished, but not in defeat. They had turned their land into a weapon. By July, the heat was merciless. The men sweated beneath the weight of their packs, uniforms sticking to their skin, boots filling with blood from blistered feet. Horses collapsed in the dust, their carcasses left by the roadside buzzing with flies. Behind the clamor of drums and commands, there was always one sound: coughing, groaning, the shuffle of the exhausted. Food became the first enemy. Bread grew scarce, rations dwindled, and men scoured empty villages for scraps. Soldiers boiled grass into soup, gnawed on raw horsehide, and cursed the emptiness of this hostile land. Some muttered that the Tsar himself had struck a bargain with the devil to defend Russia, not with armies, but with starvation. Still, the march did not falter. Napoleon's presence was a magnet that held the men together. He rode often among them, his gray coat fluttering in the dust, speaking little but radiating unshakable confidence. To the weary soldiers, one glance from him could still feel like salvation. If he was not afraid, why should they be? And yet, every mile forward stretched their supply lines thinner, like a cord pulled to breaking. Ammunition wagons lagged behind. Foragers returned empty-handed. The further east they pushed, the more the land seemed to swallow them whole. At night, campfires flickered weakly in the darkness. Men huddled together, writing letters by the dim glow, words trembling with fatigue. We march endlessly. The land is empty. Where are the Russians? When will this end? Some letters would never be sent, buried with their authors on the roadside graves marked by crude wooden crosses. Then, at last, on the plains near Smolensk, the silence broke. Cannon thunder shattered the air. The Russians had turned to fight, but not to stand and die. After fierce clashes, they withdrew once more, burning Smolensk behind them, leaving the Grand Army a city of ashes. Napoleon's men stood amid the charred ruins, their mouths dry with thirst, their stomachs hollow, their boots melted by the flames. Victory felt like loss. The road ahead, endless and merciless, still waited, and winter had not yet begun. The endless march east seemed to stretch into eternity. But on September 7, 1812, the silence finally broke. On the fields near the village of Borodino, the Russians turned at last to face Napoleon in open battle. It was here, on this blood-soaked plain, that the fate of Moscow and perhaps of Europe would be decided. The dawn was gray, the mist heavy with the smell of damp earth. Across the field, the Russian army, stubborn, silent, immovable, stood waiting behind earthworks and cannon. They were fewer than Napoleon's host, but the land itself seemed to fight with them. Behind their lines lay the road to Moscow. They would not yield it easily. Napoleon's army stirred like a beast awakening. Drums beat, flags snapped in the wind, and officers barked commands. Yet beneath the bravado, men whispered prayers. They had marched hundreds of miles, buried comrades along the road, and now faced the fiercest battle of their lives. At sunrise, the thunder began. Cannons roared, vomiting smoke and iron. The ground shook as artillery. Fire ripped through ranks of men, tearing bodies apart, turning grass to mud and blood. The air filled with the screams of the dying and the acrid stench of powder. Then came the charges. French columns surged forward, bayonets glittering, drums pounding in their chests. They stormed the Russian redoubts, only to be hurled back by cannon blasts and volleys of musket fire. The field became a furnace of fire and steel, men locked in hand-to-hand combat, fighting not for glory but for survival. Hour after hour the slaughter raged. Soldiers stumbled through smoke so thick they could not see the sun. Horses, wild with terror, crashed into lines of infantry. Officers fell beside common foot soldiers, swallowed by the same fate. The French took positions, lost them, then stormed them again. Every inch of ground was paid for with rivers of blood. Napoleon himself watched from a rise, his face carved in stone. His marshals begged him to unleash his imperial guard, the last reserve, the hammer that could shatter the Russian line. But Napoleon refused. He feared a trap, feared overreaching, and so the guard waited, silent and unused, while the battle devoured his men. By nightfall, the field of Borodino was a graveyard. Over 70,000 men lay dead or wounded. The French held the ground, but the Russians were not broken. They retreated in order, preserving their army, leaving Napoleon with nothing but corpses and a hollow victory. The road to Moscow now lay open, but the cost was a wound from which the Grand Army would never recover. And the city ahead was waiting with fire. The morning sun rose over a horizon that should have gleamed with domes and spires. The fabled heart of Russia, Moscow. For months, Napoleon's men had trudged through mud, hunger and fire for this prize. At last it was theirs, or so they thought. As the Grand Army approached, the soldiers strained their eyes for crowds of citizens, for flags of surrender, for the Tsar's envoys carrying peace. Instead, they saw silence. The great city loomed before them like a phantom, vast, glittering, yet still. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14, 1812. He rode at the head of his column, his gray coat blending into the haze, his gaze fixed on the towers of the Kremlin. Behind him, weary soldiers dragged their feet, dreaming of food, shelter, and rest at last. Surely within the city's walls there would be plenty. Surely here the Tsar would bow. But when they passed through the gates, the truth struck like a knife. The streets were empty, windows shuttered, markets abandoned, palaces deserted. Moscow's people were gone. The city of more than 250,000 souls had fled before them, carrying what they could, leaving only echoes behind. And then came the fire. It began in the night, a few flames flickering in the distance. At first, the French thought little of it. But the wind rose and the fire spread. Soon, infernos leapt from street to street, devouring wooden houses, climbing into the sky like dragons of flame. The city itself seemed to turn against them. The Grand Army awoke in panic. Soldiers rushed to save what they could, dragging buckets, tearing down doors, trying to smother flames with cloaks. But the fire was relentless. Explosions tore through the night as storehouses ignited. Sparks rained down like fiery snow. Men collapsed, choking on smoke, their lungs seared. By dawn, 3/4 of Moscow burned. The warehouses of food were ash. The hope of shelter had become cinders. Soldiers wandered the ruins, their faces blackened, their eyes hollow. They plundered what little remained: wine cellars, scraps of grain, shattered treasures, but the city gave them nothing they needed most: bread, warmth, life. Napoleon stood within the Kremlin, watching flames engulf the skyline. The dream of conquest, of glory, of peace imposed on Russia, vanished with the smoke. He had taken Moscow, yet it was an empty prize. The Tsar did not yield. No emissaries came, only silence and the crackle of burning timber. And as days stretched into weeks, the emperor who had conquered Europe sat in a ruined city, waiting for a peace that would never come, while winter crept ever closer. The trap had closed. Moscow was silent now, a smoldering skeleton of its former self. Streets once alive with merchants and nobles lay buried in ash. The churches, stripped of their gold, stood like hollow shells. And amid this ruin, Napoleon made his fatal choice. He waited. In the first days, hope still flickered. The emperor believed Tsar Alexander must yield. How could Russia endure the loss of its holy city? Surely envoys would come, carrying terms of peace. Napoleon prepared for them. He drafted proclamations, rehearsed speeches, and sat within the Kremlin as if upon a throne of destiny. But no envoys arrived. No message came. From St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander sent only silence, his resolve colder than the winds beginning to sweep the plains. To him, Moscow's sacrifice was not a defeat, it was defiance. Outside the Kremlin walls, the Grand Army withered. Supplies had burned in the fires, leaving soldiers to scavenge among ruins. They stripped wood from abandoned houses for fuel, slaughtered stray dogs for meat, and clawed through rubble searching for grain. Wine cellars were emptied in drunken desperation. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Sickness spread through the camps, and discipline frayed like rotting rope. Letters written by soldiers grew darker with each passing week. We wait in a graveyard. There is no food. There is no word. Winter is coming. Some begged Napoleon to move, to retreat before the snows fell. Others whispered rebellion, though fear of their emperor's gaze kept them silent. Napoleon himself seemed torn between pride and reason. To abandon Moscow without a treaty would make him appear defeated. To remain meant gambling against time itself. His marshals urged him, "Sire, the season grows late. If we do not leave now, the army will not survive the winter." But Napoleon, who had bent the continent to his will, clung to the belief that one more week, one more letter, would bring Alexander to his knees. The weeks bled into October. Frost glazed the ruined streets. Breath turned to mist in the air. The horses shivered, their ribs stark beneath thinning flesh. The first snowflakes drifted down like omens. Still, the emperor lingered. Still, no peace came. At last, when October deepened into icy nights and the roads hardened beneath snow, Napoleon gave the order. The Grand Army would retreat, but it was too late. The waiting had cost them dearly. Winter now stood at the gates, and the long road home promised no mercy. What had begun as conquest was about to become a march into hell. On October 19th, 1812, the order was given. The Grand Army would leave Moscow. Soldiers cheered at first, thinking of home, of escape from the city of ashes. But when they stepped onto the road, they found no deliverance, only the beginning of despair. The first snow fell like a warning. At first it was light, drifting gently across the columns of men. Some even laughed, catching flakes on their tongues. But within days the sky grew heavy and the snow turned merciless. It piled on the roads, buried wagons, and clung to boots until every step was torment. The cold crept in like an invisible enemy. Breath froze in the air. Fingers stiffened, blackened, broke. Men wrapped themselves in whatever rags they could scavenge. Curtains from Moscow's ruins, straw from abandoned barns, the hides of slaughtered horses. Still, the frost gnawed at them, relentless. The retreat was chaos. Wagons overloaded with loot slowed the march until starving men cut them loose, spilling stolen treasures into the snow. Cannons, once the thunder of Napoleon's power, were abandoned by the roadside, their wheels locked by ice. The Grand Army, which had entered Russia as the most formidable host in Europe, was now little more than a staggering mob, strung out along the frozen roads. Hunger struck harder than steel. With supplies gone, soldiers butchered their horses, gnawing on raw flesh to keep alive. They boiled strips of leather into broth, chewed bark, dug through snow for roots. At night, the campfires grew fewer. Men huddled together, shivering until their bodies stilled forever, frozen in each other's arms. And through it all, Russian cavalry and Cossack raiders circled like wolves. They struck at stragglers, cut down the weak, harassed the columns day and night. The men began to fear not only starvation and cold, but the sudden flash of sabers in the snow. Napoleon rode among them, his gray coat dusted white, his face grim but unreadable. To his marshals he admitted nothing, but in his silence lay the weight of realization. He had delayed too long. He had underestimated the land, the people, the season. The conqueror of Europe now led an army not toward victory, but toward annihilation. As the Grand Army staggered southward, through forests stripped bare and villages burned before their arrival, winter deepened. The snow thickened, the wind sharpened, and the road seemed endless. The invasion had begun with 600,000 men. Now tens of thousands already lay buried beneath the white shroud of Russia, and the true winter had only just begun. The retreat dragged on, and with each frozen mile the Grand Army unraveled. What had once been proud columns of soldiers now staggered in broken clumps, hollow-eyed, skeletal, wrapped in rags and animal hides. The road behind them glittered with frozen bodies, a path of death stretching back to Moscow. Hunger ruled everything. The men ate horses until there were none left. They boiled bones, scraped marrow, gnawed leather straps torn from saddles. When even that was gone, some whispered of darker meals, rumors that men had eaten men. Desperation made beasts of them all. The frostbitten stumbled barefoot, their boots worn to tatters. Toes blackened, then crumbled away. Fingers froze stiff around muskets they could no longer fire. Soldiers marched with dead comrades leaning on their shoulders, too numb to realize the bodies had stiffened hours before. In the snow, more fell each day. They did not rise again. The nights were worse. The temperature plunged so low that campfires barely bit into the dark. Men huddled together in pits dug into the snow, covering themselves with the bodies of the dead for warmth. In the silence of midnight, cries echoed, groans of the dying, prayers whispered into the indifferent sky, curses spat at Napoleon's name. And still the Russians came. Cossack riders struck without warning, cutting through the stragglers like shadows with sabers flashing in moonlight. Muskets misfired in the cold, powder frozen useless in damp pouches. The terrified French scattered into the snow, and the Cossacks vanished again, leaving only corpses in their wake. Discipline dissolved, soldiers abandoned their standards, their weapons, even their brothers. Loot plundered from Moscow, silk, silver, priceless icons, was hurled into the drifts by starving men, who now prized only a crust of bread or a scrap of meat. Napoleon rode among them, his face pale, his silence heavier than words. He still inspired awe, his mere presence kept some men staggering forward. But the emperor no longer commanded victory. He commanded survival. His marshals spoke of despair, but Napoleon refused to show weakness. Yet his eyes told the truth. He knew the empire itself was bleeding out in the snow. By November, the Grand Army had become a shadow. Out of the hundreds of thousands who had crossed into Russia, only a fraction still marched. The rest lay buried beneath the white blanket of the steppe, frozen where they fell, their faces locked in eternal grimaces of agony. The soldiers called it simply the Road of Corpses. And ahead lay an even crueler trial, the icy crossing of the Berezina River. By late November, what remained of the Grand Army reached the banks of the Berezina River. Wide, half-frozen and patrolled by Russian armies on both sides, it loomed like a wall of death. To cross meant survival. To fail meant extinction. The men stared at the river in silence. The ice was too thin to bear them, the current too strong to swim. Behind them, Russian forces closed in. Ahead, Russian troops barred the far shore. The trap was complete. For many, this felt like the end. But Napoleon would not yield. He ordered bridges to be built. Engineers, shivering with frozen hands, waded into the icy torrent, hammering timbers together as chunks of ice crashed around them. Men drowned before the first planks were laid, swept away by the black water. Yet by dawn, two fragile bridges stretched across the raging river. The crossing began in chaos. Soldiers shoved, cursed, and clawed their way onto the creaking timbers. Cannon wheels jammed, wagons overturned, and horses thrashed in panic. Women, children, and camp followers screamed as they were trampled beneath boots. The bridges swayed and cracked under the crushing weight of thousands. Above it all, Russian cannon fire began to rain down. Shells burst on the banks, spraying wood, flesh, and snow into the air. Men tumbled into the river, their cries cut short as the freezing current swallowed them. Still, the mass pressed forward, a human tide driven by terror. The French rearguard fought desperately to hold off the Russians. General Ney, his face as hard as the ice beneath his boots, rallied the remnants with curses and fire. Muskets thundered, sabers flashed, and the snow ran red as they bought every minute they could for those on the bridges. By nightfall, the river was choked with wreckage and bodies. The fragile crossing still held, but barely. Thousands had made it across. Tens of thousands more had not. In the panic, wagons of loot and entire batteries of artillery were abandoned, tumbling into the icy current. Those too weak to fight their way onto the bridges huddled on the shore, waiting for death. On the third day, as the bridges finally splintered and collapsed, Napoleon himself crossed to the far bank. The army that staggered after him was no longer an army. It was a tattered procession of ghosts. Out of the great host that had entered Russia, barely a fraction remained. The Berezina was not a victory, but it was survival, and survival was all that was left. The nightmare was nearly over, but the Grand Army had already died in the snow. When at last the Berezina was behind them, the men no longer marched, they drifted, broken and hollow across the frozen wastes. The Grand Army, once the pride of Europe, was now a trail of shadows stumbling westward. Snow fell endlessly, blanketing the land in silence. The survivors trudged through drifts waist-deep, their uniforms in tatters, their feet wrapped in rags. Some leaned on muskets they could no longer fire. Others stumbled barehanded, fingers blackened and stiff. Each step was agony. Each mile cost lives. Disease struck what hunger and frostbite had not yet claimed. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia spread like wildfire among bodies already weakened to the bone. The smell of rot followed the columns, mingling with the smoke of dying campfires. The Russians did not relent. Cavalry swept down upon the stragglers, cutting them apart in the snow. Villages ahead were stripped bare, offering no shelter, no food, no mercy. The men had nothing left to give. They walked because stopping meant death, and even walking was little more than dying slower. Napoleon himself rode at the center of this ruin. His face was drawn, his coat caked with frost. He still spoke of glory, of return, of rebuilding, but even his marshals saw the truth. The emperor was leading not an army, but a funeral march. Letters from soldiers, who could still write, became fragments of despair. We no longer have comrades, only shadows. Each day we bury the living as well as the dead. Many never finished their words. The ink froze in their pens, or death stilled their hands. By December, the survivors neared the Niemen River, the same river they had crossed with triumph only months before. Now it was a grave marker, the border between ruin and home. When they finally reached it, men fell to their knees in the snow, weeping, kissing the frozen earth, as though they had returned from the underworld itself. Of the 600,000 who had set out to conquer Russia, fewer than 100,000 remained. Most were maimed, sick, starving, or broken beyond repair. The road behind them was paved with corpses, hundreds of thousands, who would never see France again. Europe watched in shock. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility had been shattered in the snow. What had begun as a march of conquest had ended as a procession of phantoms. The Grand Army was gone, but Napoleon himself was not, and the world would soon learn that empires, like men, do not die in silence. When the remnants of the Grand Army staggered back into friendly lands, they were unrecognizable. Fewer than 100,000 survivors limped west, their bodies wrapped in rags, their faces hollow with hunger and frost. The conquerors of Europe had returned as beggars and ghosts. Napoleon reached Paris before the worst news could spread. He spoke of victory, of glory, of a campaign concluded with honor. But the truth seeped through like smoke through cracks. Families waited in vain for sons who would never return. Villages counted the missing in dozens, towns in hundreds. Across France, grief and rage took root. The emperor had once seemed invincible. Now he seemed mortal. The illusion that had bound Europe in fear was shattered on the ice of Russia. Kings who had once trembled before him sensed weakness. Prussia, Austria, and Britain stirred again, raising armies to strike. Even his allies questioned his judgment. Napoleon himself felt the weight of the disaster, though he concealed it beneath iron discipline. He still dreamed of rebuilding, of rallying France, of returning stronger. But his marshals had seen the truth on the road of corpses. The empire was cracked, its foundations rotting. Russia had swallowed not only his army but his destiny. For the men who survived, the memory was unbearable. They spoke of comrades freezing beside them in the night, of wolves howling over fields of the dead, of the Berezina's icy waters swallowing thousands. They had set out as soldiers of the greatest army Europe had ever seen. They returned as witnesses to its destruction. In the years that followed, Napoleon fought on, still brilliant, still defiant, but never the same. The Russian campaign had drained France of its strength, shattered its armies, and emboldened its enemies. Every battle that followed, from Leipzig to Waterloo, was fought under the shadow of that terrible winter. And so, in 1814, the emperor who had crowned himself master of Europe was forced to abdicate, his throne crumbling beneath him. He was exiled first to Elba, then to the lonely rock of St. Helena, where the sea's endless waves replaced the sound of marching drums. There in isolation, Napoleon looked back across the span of his life, the victories, the glory, the empire built by fire and blood, but always his mind returned to Russia, to the snow, to the mistake that froze his empire and shattered his dream of conquest. The greatest general of his age had met an enemy he could not outwit: winter, hunger, and the boundless will of a nation that refused to bow. The invasion of 1812 was not just Napoleon's defeat. It was the beginning of his end.